Hello everyone, and thank you for tuning in. As always, I am Kaylee Batesman, the content director at She Can Code, and today we're discussing empathy and the digital future. Now, having empathy means that you have the ability and capacity to understand and share the feelings of another person. In a world where we're all trying to increase diversity and inclusion, empathy is an incredibly important skill to possess. Empathy in the workplace can help you connect with your team and your peers, help you to understand the needs of others, strengthen working relationships, and make employees feel valued. So today we're lucky to have Mimi Nicklin, who's the CEO and founder of Freedm, with us today, and we're going to look at the role of empathy in the workplace and how companies can create a more empathetic culture. Welcome, Mimi.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm so excited to be here.
Thank you for joining us. Thank you so much. And can you kick off with a little bit about your background to start with, please?
Yeah, of course. I'm a marketer by experience. My whole career has been in marketing, in fact, in the advertising side of marketing. So I've been running agencies my whole life. I've been an expat for nearly my whole career. So I'm speaking to you today from Asia Pacific. I'm in Malaysia, but I've spent the last about 14 years in Singapore, Hong Kong, Dubai, Sri Lanka, South Africa, always in the field of marketing. In 2018, I had a bit of a life and professional change in that I started to write my book, Softening the Edge, which was a book that became all about organizational empathy, as you said in your introduction, and empathy in the workplace, and indeed in our world. And the writing of that book changed my life because by some crazy measures, it became a bestseller. And I think, 2020 had a lot to do with that, and not just the pandemic, but a lot of other things that happened socially in that year and have and continue to happen since. And in that stage of my life, I shifted to become not just a CEO of agencies, but someone that was speaking about empathy all around the world and talking to businesses and brands and audiences about why we need empathy in our work, which of course is 5/7 of most of our weeks, but also in our world, in our society, and in our community. And as I meet you today, that's what I'm doing. I'm just about to write my second book. I'm just about to launch my second podcast, and launch a whole lot of courses that do this, that help us create more understanding in our world.
Amazing. And so when you went to write your first book, what led you to that? Was there an experience for yourself when you thought, I must share this with people?
There actually was, yes. There really was. I had moved to Dubai to run a big business, a big global business. And I moved there alone as a single mum to the Middle East. And I took over a business that was substantially different from the one that I believed I was joining in terms of its sort of financial stability and stage of the business. And I was thrown hugely into becoming kind of an entrepreneur of a small business from what had previously been a very sort of corporate advertising career, kind of vice president of global, blah, 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 like those big corporate structures, right?
Yes, yes.
Suddenly I was an entrepreneur and I had no idea how to do that in a region that I didn't know anyone. I was, as I said, a single parent, and I didn't know what I was doing. I was completely overwhelmed. And I met with a business coach over lunch to say, like, help, somebody help me out of this. What am I doing? And in that discussion, she was asking me about my leadership style, and I was talking about intuition. And she said, Mimi, can I stop you? Is it intuition, or is what you're talking about empathy? And at the time I was like, no, it's not empathy. Like, what's empathy got to do with work? But it did lead me to go and research it. I discovered the empathy deficit, which is the term that we use to describe the lack of empathy that we have in our world, within humanity today. And that led me to start writing about it, not necessarily writing a book, just writing about it. And before I knew it, I had about 35,000 words. And somebody said, well, why don't you write a book? And I was like, well, surely the only people that write books are like academics or John Grisham, right? And I'm clearly like neither of those. But, my friend convinced me to try. And that was the beginning, really. Someone said yes. And 2020 happened as it did. And the book got finished, and then my life has substantially changed. I remain in advertising. My agency Freedom still exists, right? I do that. I run a branding business, but I spend a huge amount of my time and my passion on this, on trying to communicate to people why we need more empathy in the world.
Yeah, and it's so interesting there that you, when you started that, you described what you described it as intuition, which is so interesting that actually somebody pointed out to you it's in fact empathy. Because what role does empathy play in the workforce then? I mean, you know, you didn't actually realize at the time that you were talking about empathy.
Yeah, I realized in writing the book that I had been using empathy my entire career, my entire life actually. And now when I really sort of look at it, I think I probably got that from my parents, but particularly my dad, who was also a writer. And I think most writers have a great ability to empathize, because in order to tell stories and to talk from other people's points of views, you have to understand them. So in writing the book, I did discover that it was empathy I had been using, but I, as you sort of mentioned there, I hadn't really been aware of that. What we know is that there are very few business indicators that aren't impacted by higher levels of empathy. So empathy, as you touched on in the introduction, is the ability to perspective take, fundamentally, right? If you really sort of make this simple, it is a skill set and not an emotion. I like to talk of it as humanity's data set. It is the ability to understand the people in your business, whether that's your staff, your colleagues, your teams, your suppliers, your stakeholders, your board of directors, your competition, right? Whoever it is that you're working with and amongst. This ability to perspective take is to understand where people are coming from, why they behave in the way they do, the things that they're good at or less good at, the things that motivate them. The Great Resignation, why are people resigning? How do you increase tenure? Higher levels of empathy have been connected to performance, output, innovation, creativity, teamwork, communication, you name it. So there are very many indicators that show that high levels of empathy in the workplace are beneficial to both bottom line and top line, to all kinds of growth, particularly in any business where you have lots of people, which is the majority of businesses, unless you happen to be running on a production line. And even then, you need empathy with the people running the production line. So, I mean, fundamentally, we're people first, right? We're all human. And I always like to say we're more alike than we are different. And empathy allows us to understand that.
Yes. And just listening as well to you just pointing out there, just realizing, what employees are good at and what makes them tick and how to get the best out of them. Even if sometimes that can come across as, it might sound blunt. It might sound like, you're not a very empathetic person, even if it comes out quite blunt. But my boss here, I find her quite empathetic. And she said to me once, we were talking about artwork and creativity. It's really not my skill. So she pointed that out and said, you know what, actually, it's really not your skill. And I thought, you know what, you're absolutely correct. It might have sounded blunt, but if you'd led me down that route, you wouldn't get the best out of me, because I feel like I'm being pushed into an area that I'm no good at, and probably wouldn't, actually, it's not worth me trying to skill up in artwork because it's just not my forte. And I thought, I think all of us have been at that company where we've been pushed into areas where there might be a lack of resource. And I think perhaps your manager is just thinking, but we need somebody to do it. And I think, but perhaps you're not listening to who would be best for that job and who is it, best suited to, and whether or not they actually want to take up skills in that area. It's just a case of sometimes your manager just asking, even if it sounds incredibly blunt.
Asking and critically, as you said, asking, because curiosity is the core of empathy. The question why, any question that allows you to be more curious about the person that you're, like you said, putting into that role or moving or shifting. I talk about an example in my book, which you reminded me of, about a young man in the team. We had to move our team around when we were, rebuilding this business. We had to do, we just had to use the space differently in the office. And there was one young man who really didn't want to move, was very emotionally connected to where he was. And we had to move him. There was a significant shift in the space. So we had to move him. And I talk in the book about the process I went through with him, which was an extremely slow one, to understand why he cared so much. Because for most of us, let's be honest, I mean, you might prefer to be, you know, I don't know, next to the coffee machine or not, but it's not really a big deal to most people. Yeah. But for this young man, it clearly was. And I had to invest significant time, not only in listening to him, but in making sure he knew he was being listened to, because I also knew as the leader that I was going to have to move him anyway. So I was going to have to approach that with the highest level of empathy that I could, whilst getting to what the corporate objective or goal was, but maintaining our humanity, right? Making sure he felt heard, that I understood what his concern was, that we addressed that as much as we could. And I also took him through that process in a way that allowed him to empathize with me, right? To understand why his boss was making him do something he didn't want to do. So yes, you're absolutely right. Empathetic communication, listening to people and asking those questions is critical to whether it's, you know, a small thing like moving desks or something bigger like a change in your career or your skill set.
Yes, and I suppose as well with him, if he'd felt that he hadn't been listened to on the smaller things, he might then have assumed that if he needed to approach you on something bigger, that he wouldn't have had that trust, and he just wouldn't have felt that, you know, if I do need to talk to you about something that's happening in my career later in time, then he just, you know, wouldn't have felt comfortable approaching you. And it's interesting that you wanted to look into the reasons why, because even something like as small as moving in an office, I can only assume that, you know, perhaps he might have had anxiety levels, or, you know, like some people really get used to their environment, don't they? And they think, you know what, if I move, I'm going to feel quite nervous at work, or, you know, he might be quite introverted if you're moving in from a corner. And they sound like very tiny things, but they would have, you know, really affected his working day.
Absolutely, they do, and they did. And, you know, in the end, he was able to move very comfortably, you know, but it took me time, right? Real time and trust, as you said, to find out, but what's stopping you? What, you know, what is the problem? What is it, you know? And once I was able to understand all of those things, I was able to find him another space in the office that replicated that. We were able to do that together. You know, we became a team. And often that, you know, people often ask me the difference between sympathy and empathy. And one of the things I always say to people is that empathy brings you together. And this story is a great example of that. You know, it allowed us as boss and team member to get close enough together to be able to make resolutions and decisions that work for everyone, that, you know, created pro-social improvement, which is actually what empathy does on a mass scale. So all the way up to like mental health, suicide levels, like big picture social things that we could talk about. All of them, when you see empathy go up, you see pro-social behavior become more cohesive, more beneficial for the group. And of course, in that story, it's a very small one. It's moving desks. But the same principles apply when you're talking at a societal level.
Yes. So interesting you mentioned there the difference between empathy and sympathy. I remember seeing a wonderful little cartoon years ago, and it had the difference between the two. And the empathy, as you said, is, you know, finding a solution or trying to work together to help that person. Whereas on the cartoon, it had sympathy was just somebody saying, oh, would you like a sandwich? It was just completely unrelated. You know, all they'd done was pat them on the back and say, oh, do you like a sandwich?
I love that. It's so true. There's actually also a little cartoon from Brené Brown, and she has a little cartoon as well where there's two people walking along a road, and they're cartoon characters, and they fall into a pothole, like a really deep pothole. And she says, empathy is looking into the pothole that your friend has fallen in and said, like, sympathy is looking in there and saying like, oh, I'm really sorry you fell in a hole. Whereas empathy is like, can I get on in there with you and get you out? You know, yes. So it's exactly the same as your sandwich thing. Like the sympathy is, I mean, it's a very kind emotion. But
it doesn't help.
But it doesn't do anything. It's just kindness, right? And kindness is good. We need more kindness in the world. But empathy for sure allows you to increase understanding and therefore, you know, create more behavioral change.
Yes. And in terms of the tech sector, do you think there's a lack of empathy in the tech sector currently?
I think it depends which side of the tech sector you're looking at, like whether you're looking at the tech itself or the people.
Yes.
And I think regardless of which side you look on, the answer is probably yes and no simultaneously, because we are seeing great strides. And I think perhaps today we'll talk a little bit about kind of Web3 and metaverse and those types of things, but we are seeing great strides of sort of the ability for technology to change social behavior, human behavior, to potentially increase levels of empathy, to allow us to understand more diverse groups than ever before, because it breaks down geographical boundaries and all of these types of things. Having said that, of course, in a parallel world where you can create your own avatar, you can create your own new identity, you can create a whole separate world for yourself, that also allows us to some extent to behave without social consequence, or at least social consequence in the real world. So I think it's a complex question. It's a question that's very sort of based on social structure. The other thing that I would say is that people often blame technology for lack of empathy. Maybe you're talking about cyberbullying or something, and people will blame, I'm saying in quotations here, like social media. But the reality is, it's not the social media's fault. It's the people on social media, right? So that's why I say I think it's very sort of a nuanced way to answer the question, because the reality is tech is only as good or empathetic as the people that are building it and the people that are using it, because tech is tech. So as I said, I think it's a multifaceted answer, and there's definitely great opportunity to fill some of society's woes through some of the technological innovation out there. I think when it comes to the working world, so sort of corporate tech businesses, I personally don't work in them, but the ones that I work with, I think there is probably a lack of empathy on the whole. I think the tech sector has some of the longest working hours and the most high pressured environments of many that we see out there today. And in that way, I think, even just look at the Twitter debacle currently, the last 2 months, it's very easy to say that there has been a huge lack of empathy in the decision-making made at Twitter. So yeah, it's a big question. And I think depending on the area you look at, we see both the good and perhaps the less good.
Yeah, and I think as well that working in the tech sector, it ties into a lot of roles are remote as well, and that people can feel very disconnected from their teams quite easily. If you're, find yourself working on your own quite a lot as well. And I suppose trying to have that empathy and to show that towards team members that you might not necessarily see that often in person, that can be quite difficult as well.
It can. And again, it's a question I get asked a lot, which is, does remote working reduce empathy and leadership or in a team? And I would say no, it doesn't have to, but it does take perhaps a little bit more effort to empathize consistently on a screen. Mm-hmm. One of the things that the pandemic did do, which was quite a positive thing, amongst all the horror, is it was a real leveler for the introverts and the extroverts of the world, right? Because many, not all stereotype, but many people that have been working in remote tech roles for many years do so because they are introverted, they like their own space, they don't want to be in public forums or open plan offices, all of those things. And those roles have been available for much longer in tech than they were in other industries. What the pandemic has done, and just this ability to open up hybrid working to the world, is it has leveled that balance between the introverts and the extroverts, because now all of us are online, not just half of us, as it were. But creating empathy on a digital platform like we're on now, it does take a little bit more effort. You have to concentrate, you have to really focus on your eye contact. I often say in conferences, that media training will tell me that I'm supposed to have this much room between my head and the top of the screen. And I ignore all of it, because every time I'm on a screen, I lean into the computer, right? I want people to feel my shoulders are in the room with them. If you look away on a screen, it's very obvious, whereas if you're in a meeting room, you probably wouldn't notice if somebody quickly looked out the window and watched a squirrel for a minute. You wouldn't notice. If they did it on a screen, if I looked away from you now and started watching something out the window, you would immediately be like, well, where's she gone? And you'd feel maybe like I'm being rude, and I probably would be. So I think you can create empathy for sure. And there's now MRI data coming out, so sort of neuroscience data coming out to show that the levels of empathy can be replicated on platforms. But it does just mean we have to work a little bit harder at that, because we for so long have been connected in a physical world that much of our empathy is second nature. And sometimes when you're separated by a platform, you have to sort of code that second nature into your first nature, and it takes a little bit more attention to detail to make that happen.
Yes, and You're absolutely right. It did take a little while to get used to, obviously, your entire team being on a Zoom screen. And you're right. I felt at the time it was quite a leveler. I worked at a small company when we went into lockdown, and they were a great company. I always felt that we were very listened to. But I did find that sometimes in meetings, it might be hard to get a word in if you're, as you say, quite introverted. And then suddenly when I found that, we're on Zoom, you can raise your hand. You felt like if somebody would spot that you're about to say something, and somebody might, somebody might say, oh, Kaylee, did you have something to say? And that's not always as easy in a meeting, because everybody's so focused on, if we're all gathered around a spider phone talking to a client, so they're not necessarily watching each other's body language. But actually you really did notice that on a screen, and suddenly become more aware of how we work as a team. And at that company, we were one of the lucky companies where we disappeared into lockdown and we still did very well. And we actually felt like we did better as a team than we did, in person in the office. And I don't think that was the case for all teams at the time. So
no, for sure. And congratulations, because there definitely were like the teams that did and the teams that didn't thrive. And so if you were one that did, that's really testament to the leadership and the people that were in your team to making that work, which is really, really great.
Yes, I was quite lucky at the time. Will the digital future solve the global empathy crisis, do you think?
No, I don't think it will solve it. As I touched on earlier, I think there's huge potential to improve it. So what we know, for example, with VR, right, any level of virtual reality or augmented reality for that matter, we have got data that's shown in areas, things like homelessness, domestic violence, that these pieces of tech, these platforms are able to increase our empathy for others. So there was work that has come out of the US, for example, in San Francisco, actually, where they have a huge homelessness problem as a city. They have for many years. And because it's been going on for so long, they were finding that people were being very sort of nonchalant, non-empathetic, disconnected from the homelessness issues. So they used a VR experiment where they showed sort of very kind of middle class, well-off people what it was like to go from having a home to being homeless, and help them experience actually how easy that is, like how easy it could happen to someone. And the results of that showed very clearly that the people that went through the virtual reality experience we were able to impact their empathy levels significantly. So we know tech can do that. Equally, in a metaverse or a virtual world, or I guess any platform for that matter, you're able to connect with people that you wouldn't otherwise connect with, otherwise, right? So even today, you and I, Kaylee, we're connecting as if we're next door, but we're on different sides of the planet, different time zones, different weather, completely different worlds. Yet we're just in a room talking, like colleagues and friends. So again, in that way, technology is enabling us, this digital future is enabling us to understand other people's mindsets and concepts and outlooks in a very different way, which wouldn't have been possible beforehand. And then finally, I think, diversity and inclusion, technology is going to massively help in that way, because I'm of the belief that you can never be truly inclusive if you only ever hire and engage with people, in your postcode, basically, which is, more or less the truth in most countries, right? You tend to hire from people that live nearby because at least they used to have to always drive to the office. And now, obviously, technology is enabling us to hire people from vastly different cultures, contexts, societies, backgrounds, all into one organization. Again, allowing us to truly be far more diverse and inclusive than we ever have. So there are many ways that technology is going to enable that. But do I think it's going to solve it? Absolutely not, because fundamentally, this is humanity's problem. We have a 30-year empathy deficit of nearly 50%, which means that we have lost 50% of a skill set that is evolutionary, right? We need like physiologically need empathy to survive. And over the last 3 decades, we've lost 50% of that ability. We have a loneliness endemic, which is far deeper and wider than any health pandemic we've ever seen. We have a mental health crisis where over 400 million people suffer with depression. It is now the largest cost to our healthcare systems worldwide. So much, not all of it, but so much of this is being fueled by segregation, by all of the isms, right? So when empathy goes down, the isms, racism, sexism, nationalism, or any ism, go up. these are human problems, and there is no tech in the world that can solve them other than people. People have to solve these problems, right? We have to reconnect at large. We have to understand each other at large. We have to fill these gaps and create a society that's far more, connected, that's based on those values again. So can it aid? Absolutely. It's a phenomenal tool, as it is in many areas of society. But can it solve it? I don't think so. I think we have to do that ourselves, unfortunately.
Yes, I completely agree. And you just touched upon there the empathy deficit. What do you think companies can do to improve their empathy deficit?
Well, we touched earlier on listening, and I would say listening is the backbone to all empathetic evolution or sort of solution, really, the sustainable health of our employees. I think that this year, 2023, will be the year that listening leadership will go mainstream, right? We have to start listening. We're seeing things like the Great Resignation and now the Great Re-engagement, this need for people to find new ways to be connected and motivated at work. If you do not listen, you are going to lose those people. And as we've seen, the young ones just will act in a very brave and bold and independent way, right? They'll just walk out and find something that suits them better. We're also seeing, for the first time in history, we see 4 generations in the workplace, which is perhaps not as common in cities like London and New York and very advanced cities. But in much of the world, we'll see, for example, the chairman of that company is perhaps in his 70s, and then the CEO is maybe in his 40s, and then you've got mid-management, like maybe early 30s, and then you've got the entry-level people coming in at late 19. That is 4 generations in one office, potentially, right? And we have huge, what we call generational gaps in understanding, all the way down to how we communicate, whether you use a phone versus Insta chat or whatever you're using, right? So I think that the one thing that all organizations have to do, but also can do, is to listen at large. We have to build listening-led organizations where we're listening to our people. Not only will that improve things like motivation and tenure and engagement, all those things, we'll also see things like strategic thinking and creativity go up, because as listening goes up, self-censorship goes down. Because as people feel heard, it's a self-fulfilling prophecy, actually, as they feel heard, they speak more, right? Yeah. And the more they speak, the more confident they get, the less they self-censor, the more ideas reach the table, the more inclusive thinking you see, the more diverse opinions get brought to the table.
The less they're thinking, I'm not going to be here next year, I've already started looking for another role.
Exactly. So in a word or 2 words, listen more would be the answer.
Yes. And do you think that listening and empathy is a skill that can be taught? Do you think that sometimes people might think, if somebody speaks up, are they just complaining? Are they trying to play the victim? Can you teach somebody to be empathetic?
Yeah, you definitely can. We've seen it. We've got the data, we've got the evidence, and now the experience to prove that you can. It is a skill set that, like many skill sets, the more you practice it, the better you get at it, right? So you may have heard, I think it's quite a British phrase, practice makes perfect. The last few words of my book are practice creates permanence, which is just the more you get used to listening, the more you practice that understanding, the more natural it becomes, the better you get at it. Empathy is built in to all of us, right? Empathy exists in the prefrontal cortex of your brain. So we are all born with empathy, right? So lots of people ask me, but Mimi, don't you just have more empathy than everybody else? And the answer is no, we all have exactly the same amount of empathy. But of course, if you don't practice it, you lose it, right? So you have to use it to keep it in practice. So yes, you can train it. We're doing it all over the world already. We're seeing it. I sort of have a catchphrase that I say now all the time, which is the more the world talks about empathy, the more empathy the world will have. And I see it all the time. I work a lot in Asia, and sometimes those audiences are like 1,000 people on a Teams call. And every time I finish them, I have a very clear sense that we have created more empathy. Because even if 1% of 1,000 people on a Zoom call decide to listen a bit more, you've made an impact. And of course, if you do that in countries like India, where there's such vast populations, we're making a change. So yes, you can do it in your organization. There are workshops, there are processes, all kinds of things that you can build into KPIs, culture manifestos, lots of different ways.
Yes, yeah. And already in this conversation, you touched a little bit of, we talked a little bit about remote working and loneliness. And as you said, most of us have had to adapt to some form of remote working. How can we battle the feelings of loneliness?
Again, I think a huge part of that is listening led. When people feel that they're not seen or heard, loneliness obviously goes up. And I have a chapter in my book that's called Lonely But Not Alone, because for this exact reason, often we're not alone. You might be in an office with another 150 people, but you can still feel lonely. You can feel that you are not being seen or heard. So to overcome some of those feelings, I think the most important thing is to find ways to connect. Whether that's in your workplace, and as you touched on, if you find a platform that you're comfortable on, like you were saying earlier, on Zoom, you felt that people could maybe speak a bit more because they could put the hand up and they could be noticed. Finding the platforms that resonate with you, finding the places that you feel most comfortable to be seen, and that could be a social network. It could be like a Persian Cats Appreciation Club on Facebook, right? It doesn't matter where it is. To overcome loneliness, you need to find people that can see you and hear you and connect with you. And if you're not finding that in your workplace on a consistent basis, firstly, I would say you should, if you can, speak up about it and speak to your line manager and talk about that. But I also say to many sort of junior to mid-level people that if you are not finding the culture is created at the top of your organization, you're probably better to find somewhere else in the long term, because culture is created top down. That is just the reality. And if you're in a workplace where you're feeling very lonely, that you don't feel you have connection, or that there's not enough people that resonate with your way of working or seeing things, you're probably not going to find it over time. So you might want to find a different community to tap into. Talking of tech, I always find that people give, I touched on this earlier, social media such a bad rep. But when I moved to Sri Lanka, which was 2021, to cut a very long story short, I got caught in a COVID lockdown nightmare with my little girl. She was 4. We were in a very remote part of basically the jungle, and my bank cut me off and I didn't have any food, and we were in lockdown and in a foreign country, and I didn't have any cash and I didn't have any way to feed her, and it was just a bit of a disaster.
Gosh.
And I was able to document that on Instagram, and it was amazing how I didn't feel alone. Like the safety that I got from sharing that, and just from people, some of whom are my friends, and some of whom are people I just know on Instagram, never met them in real life, were like, how can I help? Hey, I'm in India. I'm not that far. Can I send you something? My sister's friend's grandmother's aunt is, 2 hours from you. So at my loneliest, like most fearful time in the last few years, tech filled that gap,
Yes.
And of course I called my family as well. But having that network around you that was watching, and that feeling that if I didn't log on, if I just disappeared off stories, for sure they would have noticed. For sure someone would have said, hey, Mimi's always here and she's not. Where is she gone? And they would have known, So I think in that way, technology can be a huge aid to overcome loneliness.
And that you probably hadn't noticed how much people notice and how much they were listening to you.
I'm always amazed. People message me like every day and they tell me things like, oh, because I remember when you did this thing. And I'm like, do you? I don't remember doing that. So you're right. You never notice how much people notice. But I believe that people are all intrinsically good. Intrinsically, people want to help. Yeah. We are pro-social. We want to connect. We want to make friends. We want to be loved. We want to be inspired. We like to connect with people that motivate us. So yeah, I think social media can be a huge force for good when it's used well.
Yes, and you mentioned a little bit earlier about VR and how being able to experience what other people are going through and how that can help. What about Web3? Is something that we hear about a lot, and that immersion into an environment. Do you think Web3 is the next step for human connection?
It's a big question. What I think is that it's a very complex time for us to be developing a second universe, because our first one is in turmoil. So we're creating Web3 from a point where there is so much stress and tension and segregation and aggression and violence in our world that we're probably creating something in a very alternative mindset. And I think that potentially we should be fixing this world before we create a second one. So that's my concern about the creation of the direction for Web3. I also think that when you have an unstable society, which for sure we're living within, right? We have political, social, economic turmoil all around us. And of course, the UK will have one perspective of that. I don't know how many of your listeners are in England versus not, but all around the world, you know, there are cost of living crises and inflation crises and war zones and all these things offsetting, you know, how we see the world. So when you have the ability to go into a secondary universe as somebody completely different, you know, I am, you know, a very small, petite female today, but of course I could log on to a metaverse and join a metaverse now as a tall, strapping, weightlifting male, right? How I would behave would undoubtedly change, right? Because I would have a different power structure and a different voice and a different way of seeing the world. What that means for social engagement when we're escaping turmoil, I think is like a social experiment that is yet unseen. Is there space, as I touched on earlier, to create connection with people you wouldn't otherwise connect with? Yes. Are we able to overcome stereotypes in many ways? Yes, because you connect with people on connection, on their engagement, on the things they say and not how they look, you know. So we can overcome things like, you know, racial divides or discrimination. But equally, we have huge amounts of fear in the world. And then you have fearful, anxious people logging on and pretending to be somewhere else at scale. I think that the balance of how humanity can handle that remains unseen because we've never done it before, right? So I think it's a very open-ended forecast for what that means. As I said earlier, we've seen that empathy can be increased in well-managed and well sort of safeguarded environments, but so much of Web3 is, you know, unregulated, unknown spaces and currencies that who knows where that might go in the years ahead. So we have to, again, just believe in people, right? Because people are behind the platforms. So we have to hope and believe that our fellow humans are going to create platforms that enable progressive growth.
Yes, I was just going to ask you about stereotypes in the metaverse, and I think you're right there, because it's an interesting one where, you know, the technology meets people, and as you say, it's the people that use it are the ones that are really going to make the difference. They're not the technology itself. So I suppose it is an answer that can't be questioned, you know, whether or not the metaverse will remove those stereotypes and how we see people. But as you mentioned right at the start as well, I feel like the pandemic really did that anyway, in terms of us working from home and being able to see, you know, your entire team on Zoom. I really felt that was quite a leveler. And I thought at the time, I was really wondering how that was affecting or how that improved things for women working in tech. And a lot of those barriers might have fallen away from them for them at the time. So I think the metaverse is going to be incredibly interesting to see how it affects stereotypes and whether or not they fall away or not.
I think I love what you said there. And I think on some level, certainly on a visual level, you know, that kind of visual stereotype as relating to things like skin color and ethnicity, it's gonna help, right? Because there is, as we know, huge amounts of unconscious bias in the world, and people judge you on how you look. That is unfortunately unconscious, but also natural, right? It's part of tribal thinking and part of just who it is to be human. So without a doubt, the ability to create worlds where we don't judge each other on how tall, small, fat, thin, what color, you know, in much of Asia, it's not even just sort of ethnicity and race, it's the shade you are of that, right? So you will judge depending on how, for example, how dark your skin tone is, comes with a whole lot of stereotypes of your history, where you've come from, how much money you've got. So those things, definitely we can overcome them by creating, you know, avatars and separate characters in that world. So yes, lots of potential.
Yes, and we're almost out of time, and I've got one last question for you. What's next for you and Freedom? You mentioned you writing a second book. What are your plans?
So for Freedom, we are a branding and storytelling agency. We're predominantly based in Dubai, but we exist to create freedom for creative minds all around the world. So we work with people across all boundaries, all borders, like we've said today, stages of life, backgrounds, whatever, we really are completely sort of borderless and biasless. So the next stage for that is to continue to scale that business and make sure that we're able to impact young creative people's lives by giving them access to a business that truly is based on freedom, right? When you want, how you want, where you want, around the restrictions or requirements that you have in your life. So for Freedom, we have lots of objectives of that into the year ahead. For me personally, yes, I have my second book deal. It's coming out of India, which is really exciting for me. It's a book sort of written from Asia for Asia. I have my brand new podcast coming out. So the Empathy for Breakfast show was my first podcast. We had about 100,000 people come in the end. And I've now sort of laid that one to sleep, and it's ready to start a new one. And I'm hoping that that's also going to go live on radio. And then I'm launching some courses, the first set for females. And I'm really excited about that, because for years people have told me, like, don't you have online courses? And I was like, no, I can't do them. And finally I'm going to start. So lots to do this year. My goal is to spread empathy. So if every day I get to tell one more person about empathy and why we need it, then, I feel like I've done my job.
Yes, gosh. Well, if you find some time for us in this year, we would love to have you back at some point to hear how that journey is going.
Yeah, I'd love to. I would absolutely love to. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much, Mimi. Thank you for chatting with us this morning. It's been a real pleasure.
You are so welcome. And I really appreciate the invitation. It's been a really great conversation. I've really loved it. So thank you so much.
Thank you. And for everybody listening, as always, thank you so much for joining us. And we hope to see you again next time.